I worked at that company for 5 years. 5 years of overtime. 5 years of fixing other people's mistakes. 5 years of believing that loyalty and hard work actually mattered. But one morning, everything ended in less than 10 seconds. My boss called an emergency meeting and asked everyone in the office to gather in the conference room. There were about 30 of us standing there, confused about why the meeting was happening so suddenly. Greg, my manager, stood at the front of the room holding a tablet in his hand. He looked unusually serious. Then he looked directly at me. "Daniel, pack your things. You're fired." Just like that. No warning, no private conversation, no explanation. 30 people stared at me like I had just done something terrible. I remember my ears ringing as if the room suddenly became too quiet. Yet for 5 years I had worked harder than almost anyone in that office. I stayed late, worked weekends, fixed emergencies in the middle of the night. And now I was being fired in front of everyone like I was some kind of problem employee. What Greg didn't know was that 3 days later he would call me again. Not to apologize, but to beg. My name is Daniel, and until last year I worked as a senior systems analyst at a growing tech company in Chicago. The company had around 100 employees. It wasn't huge, but we handled some very large corporate clients. I wasn't the most social person in the office. I didn't hang around the break room gossiping or trying to impress management. I just worked, and I worked a lot. Whenever something went wrong in our systems, people usually called me first. If a server crashed, someone would say, "Did anyone call Daniel?" If a client database broke during a migration, someone would say, "Daniel might know how to fix this." Most of the time, I didn't mind. I liked solving problems, and I believed that if I kept proving myself, eventually it would lead to a promotion, or at least some recognition. But there was one person who seemed strangely uncomfortable with how much responsibility I had. My manager, Greg. Greg had joined the company about 2 years earlier. At first he seemed like a great boss. He smiled a lot, told jokes in meetings, and talked constantly about teamwork and company culture. But after a few months, everyone started noticing something. Greg loved taking credit. If a project succeeded, Greg was always the first person presenting it to upper management as if it had been his idea from the beginning. But if something failed, suddenly Greg had nothing to do with it. Instead, he would find someone else to blame, usually someone lower in the department. Usually someone like me. At first I tried to ignore it. Office politics exist everywhere, and I didn't want to start unnecessary conflicts. But things changed when the company landed the biggest client we had ever signed. It was a logistics company that needed a complete overhaul of their internal data systems. The contract was worth millions of dollars. Everyone in the company was excited, and Greg assigned me to handle the technical lead. At first I was proud. I thought this was finally my opportunity to prove my value to the company. For the next 3 weeks, I barely slept. I designed the entire system architecture. I built the migration plan. I created the security layers and backup systems. Every night I stayed late in the office. Some nights I didn't leave until midnight. Other nights I continued working from home until 2 or 3 in the morning. My girlfriend kept asking why I looked exhausted all the time. And I told her it would all be worth it once the project launched. But what I didn't realize was that Greg had a completely different plan. 3 weeks later, the project was ready for presentation. The entire leadership team would attend the meeting, including the CEO. It was one of the most important presentations the company had ever done. I arrived early that morning to double-check the presentation slides Greg had prepared. When I opened the file, something immediately felt wrong. The diagrams were mine. The system design was mine. The migration process described exactly the strategy I had created. But something was missing. My name. There was not a single mention of me anywhere in the entire presentation. Instead, the slides kept saying things like, "developed by management," or "prepared by leadership team," which basically meant Greg. My stomach dropped when I realized what he was doing, but I still hoped he would mention me during the presentation. Maybe it was just an oversight, as maybe he planned to thank me at the end. So I stayed quiet. At 10 o'clock, everyone gathered in the conference room. Managers, developers, executives, even people from HR. The CEO joined the meeting on the large screen at the front of the room. Greg stood confidently beside the projector like someone about to accept an award. He began presenting the project, slide after slide, explaining the system architecture, describing the migration process, talking about the technical solutions. Everything he said came directly from the work I had done. But he spoke like it was all his idea. A few coworkers kept glancing at me during the presentation. Some of them looked confused, others looked uncomfortable, but nobody said anything. Finally, Greg reached the last slide. I thought the meeting was over. Then Greg suddenly closed the presentation and cleared his throat. "There's actually something we need to address before we celebrate," he said. The room became quiet, and Greg slowly turned his head toward me. "Earlier this morning, we discovered some serious issues with this project." My heart started pounding. What issues? Everything had passed testing. Greg continued speaking. "Daniel was responsible for several key reports, and unfortunately, they were incomplete." I felt my entire body freeze. That wasn't true. Not even close. Before I could say anything, Greg added, "The client contacted us with concerns about data accuracy." People in the room started whispering. I tried to speak. "Greg, that's not—" But he interrupted me immediately. "We cannot tolerate negligence like this." Then he pointed toward the door. "Daniel, pack your things. You're fired." The room went completely silent. 30 people staring at me. Some looked shocked. Others quickly avoided eye contact. My ears were ringing. 5 years of work disappeared in less than 10 seconds. HR escorted me back to my desk while everyone else stayed in the meeting. And I packed my laptop, my notebook, and a few personal items. One coworker quietly whispered, "This doesn't make sense." But nobody challenged Greg. That's how offices work. People are afraid to risk their own jobs. I walked out of the building feeling like my entire career had just collapsed. For the next 2 days, I barely slept. I kept replaying the meeting in my head, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. But the truth became obvious pretty quickly. Greg needed someone to blame, and I was the easiest target. 3 days later, I was sitting at home updating my resume when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Greg's name. I almost ignored it. But curiosity got the better of me. I answered. Greg sounded completely different from the confident manager I had seen in the meeting. He sounded nervous. "Daniel, we need to talk." I didn't say anything. Then he explained what had happened after I left the company. So the client had asked for detailed technical documentation, very specific questions about system architecture, security layers, and migration procedures. And nobody in the company could answer them, because I was the only person who fully understood how the system worked. Greg had tried to respond himself, but he didn't actually understand the infrastructure. He gave the client incorrect information. Now the client believed the entire system might be unstable. They were threatening to cancel the contract. Millions of dollars were suddenly at risk. Greg's voice became desperate. "Daniel, we need your help." For a moment, I just sat there quietly. 3 days earlier, this man had humiliated me in front of the entire company. Now he was calling me because he needed the knowledge he had just thrown away. I asked him a simple question. "Why would I help you?" Greg hesitated. Then he said something that almost made me laugh. "We can give you your job back. My job back." And after everything that had happened, I looked around my apartment. For the first time in years, I wasn't stressed about deadlines. I wasn't answering midnight emails. I wasn't fixing problems created by other people. And suddenly I realized something. I didn't want my job back, so I told Greg the truth. "Greg, you should have thought about that before firing the only person who knew how the system worked." Then I hung up. 2 weeks later, one of my old coworkers called me. The client had officially canceled the contract. The company lost millions. Upper management launched an internal investigation. They quickly discovered that Greg had blamed me for problems that didn't actually exist. Greg was fired shortly after. And me? A week later, I accepted a job offer from another company. Higher salary, better team, and a boss who actually respected my work. Sometimes karma takes years. Sometimes it only takes 3 days.